Hi there, I'm Tim Cook, Director of Research here at the Canadian War Museum. We're in the lobby of the War Museum, the museum that was opened in 2005, and it is the nation's war museum. Veterans played a key role in the creation of this museum. Veterans had been calling for years for a proper museum of history to tell the rich stories that we share in common. Veterans raised money for this museum, and they had argued for it. And when it opened on May 8th, 2005, this was a museum for all Canadians. It's a place of sorrow, it's a place of pride, it's a place of grief, it's a place of heroics. This is a place to tell our story. This is our history. The Canadian War Museum was designed by Japanese-Canadian architect Moriyama. It's an incredible building in downtown Ottawa in Le Breton Flats. Now, the building itself seems to emerge from the landscape, and Moriyama has talked about this idea of regeneration, that after war, there is a period of regeneration, and this building embodies that. Within the building, as well as in this lobby and where we're standing, visitors are greeted by rough walls, unfinished almost, these concrete walls. They are at different angles. They create a sense of discombobulation and chaos in times of war. And throughout this museum, there are different features, including Memorial Hall behind me, a very powerful space of contemplation. There are other features as well, but the building itself, the museum itself, is a key feature for those visitors who come here to understand their shared military history. We're in the Second World War Gallery of the Canadian War Museum at the start of the war. Now, this is our most frequently visited gallery, and Canadians come, I think, to understand Canada's part in the Second World War, and it was an incredible contribution that Canada made to the Allied war effort. When Canada went to war in September of 1939, it stood shoulder to shoulder with Britain and France in the war against Germany. It was a war that no one in Canada wanted, and yet Canadians felt compelled to serve. They came from across the country, every community, every city, every town, every village, every class, almost every religion. And by the end of the war, 1.1 million Canadian men and women served in the war. They served at home, defending North America, defending the East Coast and the West Coast, and in the North, and they fought around the world in multiple campaigns, at sea, in the air, on land. Canada paid a terrible price for the victory that would eventually come, with some 45,000 Canadians killed, another 55,000 wounded, and yet it was a necessary war. It was a war that had to be won. Canadians understood that at the time, and that is the story that we tell here in the Second World War Gallery. We're going to go on to the next stop now. We're in the Battle of Hong Kong section here in the Second World War Gallery. This is the battle that the Canadians fought in December 1941. I think most Canadians are influenced by the American story of the attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, that day which will live in infamy. But of course, Canadians were involved in the battles against Japan as well. We had 2,000 Canadians serving as part of Sea Force, garrisoning the colony of Hong Kong. What were they doing there? Well, they had been sent by the Canadian government to stand with the British and Indian soldiers and Hong Kong defenders in a hope that they would deter the Japanese from attacking. We know with hindsight that didn't happen. And when the Japanese began their attack because of the time zones, on the 8th of December, Canadians were involved in the ferocious battles for Hong Kong. They were outnumbered. They had no support. Most of the soldiers realized as the battle dragged on day after day that there would be no reinforcements. And yet the Canadians fought with tremendous courage and skill and bravery as they and the other defenders were pushed back to Hong Kong Island. The Japanese continued to surge ahead, and when they crossed over and began the battle in the early morning of the 19th of December, the Canadians were engaged in countless small-scale engagements. They fought again with tremendous skill and bravery, and yet the odds were against them. The force surrendered on Christmas Day, the 25th of December 1941. 290 Canadians were killed in the 2 weeks of battle, almost 500 wounded. And the survivors would face a new war, a new battle for survival. And I want to talk about just one Canadian in particular. Here at the War Museum, we showcase Canadians throughout the Second World War and in all of our galleries. These eyewitnesses to history are crucial for helping Canadians to understand the history in its personal dimension, the experience of combat, the strain of service. And one of them here is Sergeant Major John Osborne. He served with the Winnipeg Grenadiers. He was 42 years old. He was a veteran of the First War. He was an experienced NCO, and he led a force in a significant attack on a Japanese position during the battle. As the Canadians were being pushed back with the Japanese holding the high ground, as their forces were wounded, as the soldiers continued to fight bravely, Osborne himself led the attack time and time again. And at one point, the Japanese surged forward, threw a grenade amidst a group of Canadians. And Osborne, without thinking, called out a warning and threw himself on that grenade, sacrificing himself for his comrades. For his bravery, for his courage, he was awarded the Victoria Cross. And it is here, the highest award for bravery and courage within the British Empire, within the British Commonwealth, as part of Canada. And it was service and sacrifice like this that defined the Canadian battle. We're going to move on to the next stop now. The survivors of the Battle of Hong Kong, about 1,600 Canadians, were marched into prisoner of war camps, and there they faced incredible brutality, violence, and beatings from the Japanese guards. The Japanese guards broke laws of war. They treated the Canadian prisoners in a despicable way, withholding food, and the conditions were unbelievable. And we talk about that in this section of the gallery. I'll just read to you a section. Brutalized and ravaged by disease and malnutrition, the survivors of Japanese camps emerged from captivity in appalling mental and physical condition. There were diseases. There was lack of food. For those Canadians who tried to escape, and they were caught, they were beaten mercilessly, and some were executed. It is surprising that anyone survived in such a place of horror. And yet the Canadians did find ways to survive, even as their bodies were breaking down from the beatings and the malnourishment and the disease. They found ways to cope and endure. They came together like they had in battle. They relied on one another. They cared for one another. They engaged in sports when they could walk. They put on plays, they sang songs, they kept diaries, they planned for a future that they hoped would come. They dreamt about food that they would one day eat and the loved ones that they would one day be reunited with. And yet, in early 1945, with the war having turned against Japan, it looked very much like to the Canadians in the prison of war camps that they would all die before the end of the war. They would die from starvation, they would die from disease, or as their Japanese guards told them, they would be executed. And yet, in August of 1945, as the Americans relentlessly bombed Japan, as the 2 atomic bombs dropped, and as the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, the war finally ended. The Canadians had survived against all odds. And that is the story that we tell here at the end of Gallery 3, at the end of the Second World War. We're in the Canadian War Museum's temporary exhibition, Forever Changed, Stories from the Second World War. Now, this is our major exhibition at the museum, which will be open until September of 2022. And in this exhibition, which I curated, we explore the many Canadians who served during the Second World War, men and women, those in the fighting forces, those at home. And we explore it through the lens of how this titanic war shaped those Canadians. One of the Canadians I'd like to introduce you to is William Allister. He's in the section here on the war in the Pacific, the war against Japan. William Allister was a signalman who fought in the battle for Hong Kong. He survived, even though so many of his comrades did not, and he was forced to endure almost 4 years as a prisoner of war. And we explore his story. Allister, who was a pre-war artist from Montreal, a young man facing unbelievable brutality. And I have always wondered, how did these Canadians endure? How did they survive? Each one had a different way to cope. For Allister, it was through his art. He was a pre-war artist, and he painted in the camps. His fellow Canadians would steal for him canvas and axle grease, of which he created these works of art. He even put on art classes for other Canadians. And we know this because he kept a diary, and it's a full, rich diary. It's written by his hand, and it's so powerful to see those words, to see more than 75 years later an eyewitness account from within those prisoner of war camps. And this is just one of the many stories that Canadians will encounter in Forever Changed.
My father was a 21-year-old signalman in the Canadian Army contingent, and he was sent over to Hong Kong in the fall of 1941. 3 weeks after they arrived, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and the boys spent the next 4 years in prison camp in Japan, enduring starvation and beatings, etc. Yet my dad would often tell us in retrospect, he'd say, "I survived, so I'm grateful." And his motto, all his life, was forget, no, but forgive, yes. I would like to briefly share with you a quick personal story that my dad had shared with us from prison camp. Apparently, after several years of imprisonment, some of his Canadian buddies who knew he was an artist decided to surprise him with a piece of canvas which they had cut off from the flap of their prison tent at the risk of being beaten. And they also took some oil from one of the trucks and found a stick which my father sharpened and used to paint this depiction of their life in prison camp. And I would like to conclude by saying briefly that I am forever grateful to my father, whose life as an ex-POW was an example in how to follow a path to forgiveness. And he has gifted me throughout my own life when the fires of injustice and disquieting circumstances in our own time period have come forth. And it's given me the strength and courage to carry on when I remember his voice saying, "To forget, no, but to forgive, yes."
We're in Memorial Hall, a very sacred space at the Canadian War Museum. And it's sacred because of one key artifact. It is the headstone of Canada's unknown soldier. In 2000, Canada decided to bring home one of its unknown soldiers, one soldier without a name, to stand for all of the soldiers, the sailors, the airmen, the nurses, all those who served in uniform and who have died in service of this country. He was brought home, lost to his family, lost to his community, lost to his country. He was reclaimed and brought home. He rests at the National War Memorial. But here is the headstone. A headstone that on November 11th of each year, on Remembrance Day, a light shines through to a light upon this headstone. It's a very powerful moment. It is a chance for visitors to come and reflect upon service and sacrifice. It's an opportunity to bear witness to the cost of war. And perhaps it is an opportunity for many to say thank you.